computer? Okay, so we're recording. I'll also be saving the chat. If you do want to use the chat function, just be aware we'll be recording. Moving on to the next slide. The Emerald chapter does want to recognize that the Willamette Valley is located on the traditional homelands of the Kalapua people. The Native Plant Society of Oregon, we welcome their traditional indigenous knowledge about the ecosystems we live in. We are grateful for the stewardship of the land that they continue to provide and have in the past. And thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Gail here for our next couple of slides. Gail, are you unmuted, or do I need to unmute?
Yeah,
you?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. And in acknowledging Martin Luther King Day, we want to also recognize Black and brown botanists. So I did some research and picked out some people that were pretty interesting to me out of a whole group. Dr. Collins and Dr. Taylor from the past and their contributions, and Dr. Clement Negusin currently. And Stephen, if you could go to the next slide for their contributions. So Dr. Collins was pretty interesting, especially for those myco enthusiasts in our audience. He discovered the mating types in slime molds, and slime molds are more abundant than you think in our ecosystems as you keep looking and think, what are those? They don't look quite like mushrooms. And so it's fun to see those slime molds. So we recognize his contributions. And Dr. Clark mainly studied the effects of light on plant growth, which is important to understanding seasonality and phenology in plants. So a pretty foundational contribution. And currently, Dr. Clement Negusin is actually a aquatic ecologist, and she's studying aquatic animals and their cycling of nutrients in lake ecosystems. So we just want to recognize these three, and there are lots more, but thank you for their contributions.
Thank you, Gail. And just a couple of housekeeping and announcements. The Emerald chapter is looking for community members as well as Emerald chapter members to help us run this chapter. We could always use the help. We're all volunteers here. None of us get paid to do this. We really could use help if that's something you're interested in. We have. We're looking for someone to help out with the programs, help us maybe with the technology, has a technology experience to help us with Zoom and YouTube interfacing, recording and posting programs. We also have a publicity program that our publicity chair could also use help in mentoring a community and Emerald chapter member to transition into helping us with the leadership roles here. Many of us have been doing this a very long time. We could use a break, but we're looking just for contributions. If that's something you're interested in, we'll have upcoming board elections here in the spring. So if you're interested in a more leadership position, such as secretary, or even moving into like a president or vice president role, that's something. If you want to get more experience. Working with a nonprofit, working with the Native Plant Society, you can participate. Anyone can participate in our board meetings, and if you're interested in that, please see my email address there. It's EM, and to be clear, that's an underscore, EM_president@npso.oregon.org. You can email me for more information. I'm happy to get on the phone or email you and share, what we do and how you can plug in if you're interested. We do have, we're getting a lot of people coming in. This is great. We do have some upcoming field trips and an upcoming program. So next is our February program, which is highlighting local city parks. Diane Steck, ecologist, City of Eugene, will be discussing some of the botanical highlights and presenting photos from Eugene City Parks. And we're also trying to tie a field trip into this program. So more to come on that. But if for those that are not aware, every month, the third Monday of every month, we have a virtual program until April. And please join us for the next one as well. It should be, they're always really high quality. So please join us if you can. Move on. We do have some field trips coming up. In 2 weeks, Dale and I are leading a winter plant walk, and that'll be at our local arboretum, Mount Pisgah. I believe it's full, but there might be sometimes there's some last minute dropouts. Please look at our website for more information. If you Google Native Plant Society of Oregon.
Your picture here is of the merch.
Right. I realize that. I was
presentation. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't have the other one. So this was, yeah, I was going to get into this one in a second. So in 2 weeks, we are doing the winter plant walk. That's a field trip that's coming up. And this is our March field trip where the Oregon Dunes, a vanishing landscape. And I don't believe this class is full, this field trip is full at the moment. So we are limiting our walks to 10 people, due to COVID. So 10 participants, or 8 participants and 2 teachers. So, and it is, you do need to sign up, which you can do, getting more information by visiting. You can see our webpage at the bottom of the page there. And that's where you can get more information on our field trips. And again, you can also email me, and I'm happy to share, I'll respond to you with any questions. And we do plan to have, the field trip committee is very active, and we do plan on having field trips, and we'll increase, as the season goes on, we'll have more field trips. We also have our plant rambles. For those of you that are not familiar with our plant rambles, they are a little less formal than a traditional plant walk, where there's generally not a traditional leader. There will be members of the Emerald chapter, in a leadership role, making sure, representing our chapter. But this is an exchange of knowledge. So it's not just one person leading the walk. Usually the group gets together. We have different places where we start the walk, and it's a sharing of knowledge and discussion of plants and just nature and ecology. So if you're used to more of a traditional plant walk, this might not be for you. But if you want to, a less formal plant walk, where you please join us. And I don't believe you need to sign up for those. Is that right, Jenny? I believe you can. Oh no, registration is sent to members. Okay, and posted. So. Yeah, look at the website for more information, and again, you can reach out to me with questions. And we do have one scheduled for February 26th at Buford Park, the North Trailhead, and March 19th, Buford Park East. Those have been well attended. We've been running those for over a year now, and yeah, please join us if you can. Gail's been putting together these slides with botanical sightings, which is great. So this is a couple plants that are in bloom right now in our area. We have the Snow Queen, you're probably all familiar with. I'm looking up because they changed the name. It used to be Cynthurus reniformis, and like many of our and there were some classification changes. It used to be in the figwort family, the Strophyllariaceae. Now, like many of the strophs in our area are now in the plantain family, or a number of them in the Plantagnaceae. And I was looking, it's no longer a Cynthurus, it's a Veronica, which makes a lot of sense if you look at the morphological characteristics, the 2 stamens, and not as bilabiate as some of the other strophs are. And it's Veronica Regina nivalis, which I looked up. I knew nivalis meant snowy, but Regina means queen. So it's the specific epithet means snow queen, which I think it's beautiful. And I don't know the reason for the change in name, if there is already a Veronica reniformis, but I did appreciate the reniformis name, because it reminded me, if you look at the leaves here, they're reniform, so it helped me to remember the species. But that's something that's blooming now. And then also on the right here is an alder, and we'll call it alnus species for now. It could be a white alder, or probably not a red alder, but you can see the male catkins blooming here. And if you if you want to post something in the chat about some of the plants you might be seeing. We might not have a chance to talk about them, but it'd be nice maybe to put it in the chat of what's blooming in your garden or natively or in your walks that you've been going about. I like the alders. The tidbit is that they have the genus Frankia, the organism that lives on their roots and fixes nitrogen in the soil. So I find that fascinating. And I'm going to pass it off to you, Gail. Here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. And welcome, everybody. My name is Gail Baker. I'm the program chair for this chapter, as well as state vice president. And I'm very happy that you're joining us this evening, and we'll be learning lots about prairie ecosystems. So just some logistics before we start. Please post your questions in chat as you're thinking about them. We will address them at the end, and if we have time, we'll open up for direct questions to Chris Helzer, our speaker. During the talk, though, please do keep your sound on mute and your video off until the end of the program. And then we'd really all like to say thank you to our speaker. As always, thank you for supporting the Native Plant Society, and please check us out anytime at our various websites and also for past programs. So you can do the next slide, Stephen. And just to get started, just to get us in a mindset of looking at prairies, most of us here are pretty familiar with prairies from either the West Eugene area or even the small fragmented prairies in Amazon Park or over in Howard Buford Park, Pisgah Natural Area. And I've just put up the visual. Vegetation is a nice characteristic of prairies. It's dominated by grasses, wildflowers, maybe a few shrubs, but certainly not trees. So there's many other ecological aspects to prairie ecosystems, but the visuals are just for us to get in the mindset tonight. Okay, Stephen, next slide. So tonight, I want to introduce Chris, and Chris is the prairie ecologist. And we're very happy to have him here. He's studying the tall grass and mixed grass prairies near the Platte River and Aurora, Nebraska, where he lives, and that's about 1,800 feet elevation. So he's on prairie time, which is 2 hours ahead of us. So we'll be kind of mindful of that at the end of the program as we're asking him questions. But he has offered to stay as long as you guys are interested and have some questions for him. Chris is the Nature Conservancy Director of Science in Nebraska, and he's been that for about 25 years. His main role is evaluating and capturing and sharing lessons from the Conservancy's land management and restoration work. And I noticed a bunch of restoration ecologists in our audience, so hopefully you have great questions for him. He started out his graduate work in grassland birds, and now he's thinking more toward plants and invertebrates and those interactions in the prairies. He shares lessons and photographic essays to raise awareness about prairies in a lot of different ways, venues, like programs like this, but also articles and books. And if you could go to the next slide, Stephen. Oops, sorry, go back. Oops.
Yep, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. One of the books that I noticed was listed on Chris's website was a field guide to roadside wildflowers in full speed. At full speed, a humorous field guide of blurry photos. And that particularly resonated with me. That's it, thank you. So he's got a major book here, but like I said, the book that resonated with me was the one doing botany at high speed. And when I was an undergraduate and taking a botany class, we'd go from place to place and we do some high-speed botany. And I don't know whether that was as fast as full speed, but I think that's great. So Chris also has a fantastic blog that I recommend you all check out. It's really an enlightening conversation about prairie observations and restoration. So it's where he combines his knowledge and insights from science and the general observations about the value of prairies and prairie conservation. So tonight, he will give us a very intimate view of prairie ecosystems. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. And I'll wait for Stephen to give me permission and start sharing. Yeah, the roadside guide book you mentioned gets a lot of attention. It's pretty funny because I meant it as a joke because it's a bunch of blurry photos, but I did enough work on it that it actually is it's a field guide of, I think, what is there, 20 or 30 species of plants in there. And it's shocking to me how many times I hear from people who have stumbled across that. Of all the things that I've done in serious efforts to educate people about prairies, the one time not the one time, but one of my goofiest things has become one of the things I'm best known for, which I guess is funny. Anyhow, it's great to be with you tonight. We were talking before about elevation. It's rare that I get to talk to people who are at a lower elevation than I am here in Nebraska. I always figure I'm pretty low elevation, but I guess 1,800 feet is pretty high for you. I want to start off with a question. I want to ask you, when you think of prairie, and this is great because Gail gave you some visuals, but what comes to mind when you think about prairie? And for me, in this part of the world, a lot of times I think about places like our Nebraska Sandhills, which is 12 million acres of this incredible, vegetated sand dune prairie landscape. Or I might think about distinctive bird species that are tied to grasslands, or the herds of bison that used to be more prevalent, but still exist in a few places. Likely with this group, you're thinking about things like floral diversity and beauty. And then now think about your friends that are not botanists or not ecologists. And what do you think they think of when they think of a prairie? Because in my experience, it's either flat fields full of grass, or more importantly, just sort of a landscape that's not that interesting. And some of that, of course, is that when you look at a picture like this, most of us are looking in there and we can identify, if not species, but at least something we recognize, right? And you can start to pick out that there's a bunch of different plants growing in there, even though it's all kind of a, tonal green color. But most people, because they don't have that background, they can't identify anything, which makes it look even less interesting than it might just as a flat area full of grass. And this is a big deal, because if people aren't interested in prairies, our challenge of getting them to care about prairie conservation is probably insurmountable. And all of the work that I'm doing, all the work that you're doing, isn't going to mean much if we don't have the public support behind us. And I think it's easy when we try to convince people that nature is important or prairies are important, we kind of slip into this like lecture about the facts, right? Yeah, clean water, carbon storage, all these things that you can bang people over the head with, that this is why you should care. And all those things are true and all those things are important, but maybe not the best way to start a conversation. When you meet someone for the first time on the street or in any kind of conversation, you don't generally start spouting facts at them. We get to know each other. We share stories. We gain empathy. And I think we need to think about how to do the same thing when we try to talk to people about conservation. And so I want to talk briefly about the idea of storytelling as a way to get more public support for conservation. And then I'm going to spend most of my time talking about a project that fits into that. And the thing is, we've got so many stories to tell. There are things like monarch butterflies that have really captured people's attention in recent years, especially. And monarchs are a great species to think about because they're recognizable, they're beautiful, they're big, they're pretty easy to find in a lot of places. But also, they happen to rely on plant diversity and resilience and a lot of the things that the rest of the ecosystem that they participate in also rely on. And so they're kind of a nice bellwether in terms of how things are going. And if you get people to care about monarchs and do what monarchs need, you're going to be helping a lot of other species and communities at the same time. But then there may be other things that are less recognizable, right? Like a bobolink. And if you spend time in prairies, I know there's bobolinks in at least parts of Oregon. You know, I always look at them and think of they look like a blackbird that had a lobotomy, but they sing like R2-D2 from Star Wars. They put their nest right on the ground, which boggles people's minds if they're not familiar with grassland birds. There's so many things that are fun about bobolinks. And that's just one of many, many different, you know, bird species that live in prairies. And then the invertebrate world is unlimited in terms of stories. So one example I use a lot is the Yucca Moth, because it's got this mutualistic relationship with yucca plants, in that the only pollination that we think happens with these yucca plants comes from these Yucca Moth species. And there's a different Yucca Moth species for every yucca species. And the reason that most or all of the pollination happens by these moths is that they will physically go up and gather pollen, and then they'll carry it over in their mouths or underneath their mouth parts into the ovary and stuff it inside where it can do the fertilization job. So it's not a flower that's set up for sort of accidental pollination as a bee or a butterfly comes into contact and then comes into contact, you know, and moves the pollen to the right place. That has to be done pretty intentionally. And what's really cool for me and that makes it an even better story is that not only is the Yucca Moth benefiting from this by, you know, making sure that the flower is going to produce enough seeds that her young can feed on, because her larvae feed on those developing seeds. But the yucca flower has sort of a built-in mechanism for avoiding too many eggs being laid in it. So as far as I know, no one has figured out the actual mechanism for doing this, but it has been shown that if there are more eggs, or more than a certain number of eggs that are laid in the flower itself, the plant will abort the flower and the flower just sort of drops off. And it's just, okay, I'm going to cut those losses and move on, which is a pretty staggering thing to think about in terms of how that might happen. And it makes a good story. There's a bee around here called the Southern Plains Bumblebee, which is not a very common one. It's an at-risk species, but you see it around if you know what you're looking for. And the way to recognize it here is that it has a really nice haircut. If you look at a lot of bumblebees, they look a little scraggly, a little fuzzy. Some of them, if you see them early in the morning when they've just gotten up and it's wet outside, look pretty rough before they dry out. But the Southern Plains bumblebee always has this beautifully coiffed haircut, nice and trimmed all across it, really easily recognizable. Plus the fact that it does all the cool things that bumblebees do, right? It's a honeybee, but better. It's got, you know, the queens and the workers and the social system that the honeybees have, but they're bigger, they fly further. I think they're prettier. But Southern Plains bumblebee is just another example. And then there's things like hognose snakes. I don't know if you have hognose snakes in Oregon. There's a couple of varieties. There's eastern and western hognose snakes in Nebraska. And both of them are really good at pretending. So this one has flattened its head in an attempt to look really, really scary, because I came across it as it was basking in a little bare ground, and it flattened its head. It started to hiss. It was inflating and deflating its body in this really impressive way, making this horrendous sort of hissing sound. It was pretty intimidating. But I didn't leave. I started taking pictures of it. So I did it for a while longer, and then it gave up. And I don't know if you know what hognose snakes do as the next stage, but then they pretend they're dead. They pretend they're dying. And they do this horrible writhing motion where they flip upside down and they squirm around. And they look like, you know, they're in the last little throes of life. And they'll do that for a few seconds, and then they'll eventually just stop and they just stare at you to see what you're going to do. And it's the most charming thing in the world. Even if you're afraid of snakes, if you know what's going to happen and somebody's there with you, especially to interpret it, it's an amazing process to watch. So this is that same hognose snake just trying to look at me and figure out what I was going to do. And eventually I just walked away so that it could continue on. But, you know, a great species to talk to people about and engage them with nature, as long as they're not too freaked out about snakes. Back to invertebrates, this is the Cudweed Grasshopper, which is a near specialist, near exclusive feeder on cudweed sagewort, which is Artemisia ludoviciana. And around here, if you want to find them, you just find a patch of the sagewort and you start kind of kicking through it with your feet. And you'll see these little white grasshoppers popping off of it. But if you don't do that, they're almost impossible to find, because look at the color match and the texture match. It not only matches color, but also the texture of the plant. It's just a really cool little adaptation. And then my favorite invertebrate to talk about with people is this one. This is the camouflaged looper. So it's an inchworm. It's actually smaller than an inchworm because it's not quite an inch long. But it's an inchworm that feeds on flowers and different pieces of flowers, but it also uses those pieces of flower to decorate itself and to camouflage itself. So all those things that are on the back of this caterpillar were put there by the caterpillar as camouflage. So as it eats, it'll take a few bites to eat, and then it'll take another bite, and then it'll wrap itself around and glue it basically to a little hook on its back using its saliva. And then as those pieces of flower dry up, it'll replace them with fresher pieces so that it looks good and maintains its camouflage. And then if it switches to a different flower, it'll switch its camouflage over a period of a few hours or so to match the new species that it's on. Just an amazing little adaptation for an insect, in this case, that has a brain the size of a pinhead probably. And a quick story about this one. This individual, I was up at a field station that we have at the Nature Conservancy up in northern Nebraska in the Sandhills, and I saw this as I was driving back toward the cabin I was staying at, and so I photographed it for a while, and then I grabbed it because I wanted to show some other people, because you don't see them very often because they're so well camouflaged. And I took it back and I put it in a jar with a couple different kinds of flowers, and put some water in the jar. And then I got worried because I thought, well, maybe it's going to fall. And if it falls, it's going to fall in the water. So I put a paper towel below it so that if it fell, it would hit the paper towel and be able to hop up on a plant. And then I put another glass over top the jar so that it couldn't get away. And I thought, well, this will be great because I put a couple different plants in there. I'll be able to take pictures of it tomorrow and show people that it changed its costume. So I got up the next morning and I looked at it to see how it had changed its costume. And it had changed its costume, but not in the way that I expected. So instead of going to a flower and choosing pieces of flower, it picked up pieces of the paper towel and camouflaged it with that, which just made it even more so my favorite insect of all time. Okay, so storytelling, super important. And what I'm hoping to do is to convince you that everybody needs to do it. Everybody on the call here needs to be involved in this kind of storytelling, even if you have other things to do, because everybody's busy. And I know it's probably not your direct job to do outreach or education or whatever, or maybe it is, but even if it's not, my question is, if it's not us, who's going to do it? Because we're the ones that have the passion about the ecosystems that we love and the work that we do and the plants that we like, all those sorts of things. And the other question I get a lot is, well, how do I do this if I'm not a photographer? You're a photographer using your photos to tell your stories. Well, that's just my way of doing it. You don't have to do it the way I'm doing it. And in terms of photos, I post a lot of things to Instagram. This photo right here is the most liked photo I've ever put on Instagram. It's just a picture of me with a bunch of flying ants around my head. I took it with my phone. You can do the same thing. You don't have to have great photos. You just have to have a story that goes along with the photo to get people to care about them. And you don't have to be an expert. I think that's really important. You don't have to know that this insect right here is a mantid fly, which is a wasp mimic related to antlions, and it's got the same kind of raptorial forelegs as a praying mantis, but it's not a fly, a mantid, or a wasp. You don't have to know any of that kind of thing. You just have to say, look at this amazing insect. This is a cool little creature that I'd like to know more about. It's the passion that you have that matters. And that matters so much more than your knowledge. And you can do things just like asking questions, right? You can just say, I saw this amazing creature. I have no idea what this is. What is it? What do you think it does? What do you think it does with those front legs? And that'll get people interested. If you're interested in it, the people that are connected to you are going to be connected to the things that you're interested in. Okay, so that's my soapbox. I'm going to step off of that in a little bit and share a project that is in that sort of vein. So Gail mentioned earlier that I write a blog. I never thought I was going to be a blogger. I still don't think of myself as a blogger necessarily. But I wrote that management book about prairies and realized very quickly that it was out of date as soon as I was finished writing it. It took a year to get published, and I already had so many different ideas I wanted to talk about. And I realized that when you write a book, you don't get feedback very often. And I really wanted to have more of a discussion. And the only way I could think of doing that was to write a blog, which I had never read blogs before, but it seemed like something that was worth trying. And that was 11 years ago. And it's been going really well. We have a strong audience that is really good about giving good feedback. But one of the things I find is that I'm trying to tell the same messages in different ways, sort of like a preacher, right? It's really the same story, but you try to tell it in different ways to keep people engaged. And so I decided that I wanted to do something with this local prairie that I have. There's a small prairie in Aurora where I live called Lincoln Creek Prairie. It's mostly a restored prairie, planted in the 1980s with, a pretty good seed mix of around 100 species probably. It was one of the first attempts of a local nonprofit called Prairie Plains Resource Institute. And it's got a little hiking trail through it. And if you look at this picture, off to the left underneath the tree over here is our local dog pound. So this is just a really skinny little strip of prairie with trees along the edge. But there's a lot that happens there. And I know that because as a photographer, I go spend the time there because it's close to my house. And I thought, okay, if I want to get people to think about the diversity of prairie, especially at the small scale, I think one of the things that is important for people to really engage with prairies is to realize how much is going on at a small scale. And the way to do that is to sit down and really look, right? To really sink into the prairie and spend time looking at it closely. So I thought, okay, well, what if I mark out 1 square meter in this prairie, and I'll just spend as much time as I can over a year photographing everything I can find just within that square meter. And I should be able to show people how much you can see if you really start looking. So I did that. I put 4 flags in the ground. It was a pretty random location, but not completely random. I made sure that there was some butterfly milkweed in there because that's a plant that I like, and I thought there would be good stories attached with that. But it was representative. It wasn't, I didn't cherry pick a spot that I thought was going to have the most diversity or anything like that. It was a representative plot. And I just set out to, like I said, photograph everything I could within that square meter plot over the next year. So from here on out, every photo you see from here until the time I stop talking will have come from that square meter of prairie. And over that year, from the end of January in 2018 to the end of January in 2019, I went over to the prairie 46 times, average length of visit with 30 minutes. That was so variable from 10 minutes to an hour and a half a couple of times. And the idea that I would have spent an hour and a half staring at a square meter of prairie before I started the project would have sounded crazy to me. And part of the story of this is the diversity of species that I found. And I had rules for myself. So in order to count a species on my list, it had to be something that I got a good photo of. So there were a lot of insects that got away that I never got photos of. So I didn't put them on my list. And it had to be within that square meter. Now, that got a little bit fuzzy because there would be plants that would be rooted in the square meter, and then they would come up and then they would droop over the edge. As long as it was on a plant that was rooted in the square, I counted it. Regardless, I was able to document 113 species, which I think to people who are familiar with prairies is nice, but not out of this world abundant. But for people who don't know anything about prairies, the fact that you could find 113 species of plants and animals in a square meter is pretty impressive, and it gets people's attention. So of those species, only 15 of them were plants. So again, this is a restored prairie. 15 is pretty good for a restored prairie in this part of the world. A nice remnant prairie might have 15 or 20 if it's really high quality. Go a little bit further east, you can get more of the tall grass prairie. You get 25 to 30 per square meter if you're pretty diverse. But 15 was pretty good, I thought, for this site. But it got really fun when I started looking at invertebrates. So 22 different species of flies, 18 different species of beetles, 14 different species of bees, and then 44 other species of mostly invertebrates. But that diversity was really only part of the story. What was really more important is getting back to my theme was stories. And so I mentioned earlier that when I picked out the square meter butterfly milkweed, Asclepias tuberosa, was a big piece of that because I really like the species. It's a great pollinator plant, attracts a lot of insects. And I thought this will be great. As long as I have butterfly milkweed to anchor the project, this is going to work out. What ended up happening was this insect right here, which is a false squash beetle or false squash bug, sorry. This was the only insect I ever photographed on butterfly milkweed within my plot, which was crazy because I would walk into the prairie and I'd walk past all these other butterfly milkweed plants and I'd see them just loaded with insects. And I'd get close to my plot, I'd stop and look at it from a distance and there'd be nothing on that butterfly milkweed plant. And then I'd sit there for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes, whatever, and nothing would come to it. And I still don't understand why. I have no idea what was wrong with that butterfly milkweed plant, but it just had very, very few insects visiting it. And it wasn't just while I was there, as it turns out, because that whole milkweed plant with multiple flowers made one pod. It created one seed pod. So it just really didn't get pollinated very well. And because I was relying on not only the flowers, but also the seeds of these milkweed plants to make good pictures, I watched that single pod like a hawk. And I was there one morning about 10 o'clock in the morning. I noticed that the pod had finally split open. It was September something. And it just had barely split open. I thought, okay, I'm going to come back here tomorrow and I'm going to start taking pictures of these beautiful fuzzy papaces on these seeds. And I went home, and about 2:30 in the afternoon, I started thinking, all right, if that pod is opening today, what if it opens today and by tomorrow all the seeds are gone and I would have missed it? And I couldn't get it out of my mind. So I grabbed my camera, went back over to the prairie, and sure enough, when I got there, it had opened all the way, or at least a lot more. And some of the seeds were starting to pop out. So I took some pictures. I shouldn't have panicked. It was there for the next several days. And I went back and I got multiple pictures, a fraction of which I'm showing you here because I got many, many more pictures than this. But I was able to get lots and lots of milkweed seed photos, not just from the pod, but after they had fallen and started to stick to parts of the plants around the plot too. One of the other things that I liked about the plot is it had lead plant. So this is Amorpha canescens. It's a shrub that acts like a wildflower. People call it prairie shoestring because when people were initially plowing up the prairies after European settlement, I guess the roots would snap like a shoestring, which is kind of a depressing reason to call it that. But a gorgeous, gorgeous legume, and lots of insects ended up showing up on it, including this fun little beetle. Here's a little wasp that showed up. This is a flower longhorn beetle. And then this was fun. I didn't know what it was when I took a picture other than a bee, but it turns out this is a specialist feeder on lead plant. So I don't know if it's the exclusive food plant of this bee, but it definitely is the one that it goes after. And it was pretty neat to find that bee, that specialist bee, in this little tiny sliver of restored prairie with in the middle of cornfield country. And then unfortunately, we also had Japanese beetles, which around here has been invading now for maybe a little bit less than a decade probably, but it's really nasty invader in gardens. I'm starting to see more damage in prairies. I don't think it's going to be a destructive thing in prairies that we really worry about, but it did a number on some of the lead plant flowers within the plot. And then this is just a photo that shows the fall color of lead plant, which is not something I just hadn't paid attention to. And that was something that I enjoyed getting out of the plot and out of the project. So stiff sunflower, this is Helianthus Pasaflorus. It's a perennial sunflower, and it was another one that I was excited about. It's one of my favorite plants, great pollinator plant, just a really striking looking flower. And as a sense of foreboding here, I want to show you these three beetle species. Because I was again, just like the butterfly milkweed, I was really counting on this to produce a lot of pollen and nectar and attract a lot of insects. And as it turned out, this beetle right here and a bunch of its friends basically ravaged every single one of those flowers that bloom. So as soon as it would open, those beetles were all over them, eating all the pollen, all the nectar, all the anthers, all the ovaries, all the everything, stigmas, styles, petals, everything, and just left the flowers shredded. And so I got really very little for diversity of insect photos off the flower, but I got a lot of good story out of it. And when the smoke from Western wildfires was, clouding up the sky, and we were taking pictures of red suns and things like that, I could I could backlight this shredded sunflower. If you look really closely on the right side of that sunflower, you can see one of the beetles up there too. Actually, there's a couple if you look closely. And then the sunflower blossoms for stiff sunflower that didn't get hit by the beetles were only not hit, I think, because they got hit first by the head clipping weevils. I don't know if you're familiar with these, but they will basically girdle the stem underneath the sunflower or a silphium plant flower, and then they lay their eggs inside the flower. And the larvae start to develop, but eventually that flower drops to the ground because it's been basically decapitated. And then the larvae finish their life cycle inside the flower, and then they burrow into the soil where they pupate over the winter. And so it's sort of like I guess the mother is providing like a quick elevator ride down to the ground to save the insects, maybe from just having to make the dangerous journey themselves down the plant where they can get picked off by something. I don't know, but it's a fun strategy. And it's something that's really visual evident or visually obvious to people if you know what to look for. And then while I lost all my stiff sunflowers, fortunately, there were 2 species of sunflower, perennial sunflower, in the same plot. And Maximilian sunflower saved the day in a lot of ways, but partly because it was such a great attractor of pollinators. So here are 3 different species, 2 bees and a beetle on the same flower, feeding on the nectar and pollen. You know, sunflowers are so generous with their pollen and nectar resources, like a lot of other plants that have that same form, right? They literally put it out on a platter and they just say, you know, come and get it. They don't hide it inside their flowers like orchids and try to trick things, or like legumes where you have to squeeze into a flower to get to it. They just open up and say, here you go. And sometimes that doesn't work out very well when you have a bunch of leaf beetles come and eat you, but it attracts a lot of species, including these little tiny pollinators like this little tiny wasp up here, and bigger pollinators like this bumblebee, and all kinds of things in between that are fun, like this cuckoo bee, which is it's a nest parasite bee that, you know, goes into the nest of a solitary bee that where the single mom just makes a hole in the ground and, you know, lays eggs and brings food. She'll go in there and put her own egg in there, just like a cowbird would do in a grassland bird nest. This they do in a bee nest, and the all that food and nectar that the mom worked so hard for ends up just feeding the cuckoo bee babies instead of her own, which isn't very nice, but it's a really cool story. So the other thing about Maximilian sunflower is that it attracted these soldier beetles. And I don't know if you've seen soldier beetles or know what they are, but they're predators, but they also have this really, as adults, they have this taste for pollen, and they spend a lot of time feeding on flowers. And every picture I took of them, I think, had pollen all over their faces, which was great. And I had a lot of fun photographing them from different angles. They sit really nice. They're pretty easy to photograph. And so I did a lot of photographs of goldenrod soldier beetles. And then eventually I got to the point where I was ready to take pictures of other things like sunflowers without soldier beetles on them. And it started to get hard to find things or find ways to get pictures of sunflowers without soldier beetles because they were on every sunflower. And even if I wanted to take a picture of, say, a bee, there would be a soldier beetle right next to it. Here's another bee with a soldier beetle next to it. And here's another bee with a soldier beetle next to it. And pretty soon I decided they were just photobombing all my photos for fun. So here's a bumblebee with a photobombing soldier beetle. Here's a hoverfly with a soldier beetle in the foreground, making itself blurry, but in the picture. Here's another bee with a soldier beetle behind it. And then eventually they were gone. They were out for like 10 to 14 days. I can't remember exactly. And then just as suddenly as they showed up, they were gone. I didn't see any more in the plot at all. I was really hoping to get monarch butterflies just because, like I said earlier, they're a great ambassador, I think, for prairies and for nature in general. And I did get this quick picture of one that was right. It was there when I showed up, and I took a picture from a distance just to make sure I could document it in the plot, but it flew away as soon as I got any closer. And I thought, well, that's okay. I guess I got it. But fortunately, a few days later, I found one early in the morning that was a little cooler and not ready to fly yet. And I was able to get some better pictures of it as it was opening its wings and warming itself up. So I got a little bit more intimate photo of this one. And I wanted to talk about flies because I mentioned earlier I found 22 fly species. So it was the most diverse group of animals or plants that I found within the plot, which wasn't super surprising to me only because I had researched these earlier. And it turns out that in North America, the most diverse group of insects of all is flies. So globally, it's beetles, right? Mostly because of the tropics. But in North America, the most diverse group of insects is flies, which includes mosquitoes, it includes a lot of robber flies, things that, don't look like this one does, like kind of like a housefly. But what's funny is very few people, so for example, in your head, how many fly species can you name? Go. Housefly, horsefly, deerfly, fruit fly. Dragonfly doesn't count, butterfly doesn't count. There's not very many that I could name by species. And yet there are more than 60,000 species of flies in North America. 60,000 species of flies is a lot of flies, even if you count mosquitoes, which, I don't know how many mosquito species there are, maybe a few hundred, maybe 1,000, not 60,000. And a lot of people, I think when you think of flies, think of something that looks like this, right? Does this look like a housefly to you? It looks like a housefly to me, but it's not. And neither is this, even though it kind of looks like a housefly. This one definitely is not a housefly. Here's a fruit fly. I know that. Here's a picture wing fly, because they're pretty distinctive looking. They look like they're wearing gas masks, or at least this one does. But the picture wing you can see comes from the wing itself. This one is called a big-headed fly, which is ironic because it's so tiny. This is Indian grass, Sorghastrum nutans. I don't know if you're familiar with the species, but if you look at the scale of that stem of the grass and the auricle and just the leaf coming off of there, you can see how small this tiny little fly is. Here's a really cool iridescent shiny fly. This is a predator species called a long-legged fly. It feeds on ants and other small creatures that it can catch. Here's a hoverfly or a flower fly. There are a lot of different species that look very similar. Here's a different one. Here's one feeding on Indian grass pollen. Saw a lot of those species coming through. And then here's a hoverfly that looks like a bee. So it's more of a bee mimic. Most people would, if they saw it from a distance, would very easily confuse it with a bee. If you want to know the difference that's easiest, the technical difference that people talk about is the number of wings, where flies have 2 wings and bees have 4. But I don't know how many people actually get to see a bee close enough to count their wings. They always look like they have 2 wings unless you look really close. With these flies, though, if you look at their face, they have huge eyes compared to bees that take up a large part of their face or their head. And then their antennae are just different. Bees have antennae like you think of an insect. If you're going to draw an insect, you draw antennae like a bee has. Flies often have these tiny little antennae that look like they're on their nose. So that's pretty different looking. All right, anybody know what that is? It's sort of a rhetorical question because I'm pretty sure nobody will. It is a plant hopper called a Durbid plant hopper, but I didn't know that at the time. When I saw it, it looked to me like an exoskeleton of something because it was translucent. It was early in the morning. There was light coming through it. It looked like it was hollow. And I thought, well, this will be great. This will be easy to get a picture of. I don't know if I'll ever figure out what it is, but at least it's not going to fly away from me. So I set up my tripod. I took my time. I got it focused. I took a picture of it, took another picture of it, and then it started to walk, which freaked me out a little bit. And it was weeks later that I saw another one and I got another picture of it. Maybe the same individual, maybe not, I don't know. And I noticed the colors on the wings, which are amazing. These reds and blues and the size of the wings compared to the body. But, this is a plant hopper that sticks its proboscis into a plant and sucks the juices out of it. It's not a zombie insect, even though that's what I thought just for a flash of a moment. And then I also saw this plant hopper, which is called the two-striped plant hopper. And it's one of those amazing insects that is adapted to make itself look like a leaf, right down to the venation, which is amazing to look at. Spiders, lots of spiders in the plot. I think if I remember right, 7 different species of spiders, which actually I thought maybe I'd get a few more, but 7 is pretty good. So here's an arabesque orb weaver, for example. Here's a completely different spider species that looks pretty similar. This one is called a lynx spider. These are more ambush predators that, like a jumping spider, will creep up next to its prey and then try to jump on them and catch them. And this one was fun because, speaking of stories, because I was taking the time to really look and watch these things and see what was happening, I got to watch this spider hunt for a while. And there was this tiny little white abdomen fly that landed nearby. And as I was photographing the spider and then I photographed the fly, I got to watch them interact. And I got to watch that spider jump and get the fly, and then I watched him eat it for a while. Here's a jumping spider that has this almost like a metallic gold look to it. Just a gorgeous spider. And I also got to watch that hunt. And so it got to kind of stalk this ant until an ant got close enough that the spider was able to catch it and eat it. So I got to watch that one too. So two different spider hunting scenarios played right out in front of me just because I sat still and watched closely for long enough. And then this is just one more jumping spider photo. This is a different one, but jumping spiders to me, if people are uncomfortable with spiders, these fuzzy, especially the fuzzy jumping spiders, they're the little teddy bears of the spider world. And, you know, they're really gentle. You can hold them on your hand. If you get them to jump from one hand to the other, you can move your hand out of the way. And so it falls, and it attaches a safety line when it jumps, so that if it falls, it doesn't fall very far. It has a safety line attached. It can crawl back onto your hand. They're just really fun to play with and to show people that spiders are not super dangerous, most of them. So praying mantises are I have mixed feelings about praying mantises. This is a Chinese praying mantis. It's an invasive species. It's not native to the US. There's pretty good growing evidence that it's problematic in terms of its impacts on other species around it. But god dang, they're so charismatic. And as a photographer, they're so much fun to take pictures of because they just pose really nicely. They've got these pseudo pupils in their eyes. So those little dark spots are not really pupils, of course, they're compound eyes. But the way the light passes through them, it forms these little black spots. And as you move around, the black spot follows you like they're looking at you, but they're not. It's just a trick of the light. But man, they just look so charming. If you don't think about all the things that they're eating that you wish they weren't eating, they're really neat to take pictures of. Here's a similar species called the European mantis, which is also a non-native invasive species, but equally charming in a different way. In the same day that I photographed that European mantis, I saw it while I was spending time looking at this beautiful tree frog. And this was a great day because I had never photographed a tree frog before this day. In Aurora, we're on the western edge of the Cope's Gray tree frog range in the kind of the Midwest Great Plains area. But the species is moving west slowly. It's been spreading to the west, mostly because we're getting more and more trees, which is not great news for prairies, but it's pretty nice if you want to see tree frogs. And I'd had a few friends in town that had seen them or had them on their screen door or whatever. And by the time I got over to take a picture of them, they were gone. They couldn't find them anymore. And so it was really fun for me that the first tree frog I ever saw in Aurora and the first tree frog I ever photographed was in this one little square meter plot. And I spent lots of time playing with this very nice cooperative tree frog, taking pictures of it from lots of different angles. And even if it jumped to a different place, it would sit and pose for me. So that ended up being a pretty great day and a good story too. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to got an automated series of photos here that are just going to flip for a few minutes, showing you more photos that came out of the same square meter that I don't necessarily have time to tell stories about, but I could. And they're going by really quickly, but that's kind of the point because I want to show you the number of them. And just remember that, again, not to belabor the point, but every single one of these photos came from the same square meter of prairie. And it's not that all of those species spend their entire lives in the square meter, but it's more the point that if you really sit down and you really take the time to pay attention to one small area, it's a shocking phenomenon to see how many different things you can find just within that small space. And it's not so much about the space, but it's about spending the time, right? It's about changing your perspective. It's about focusing in. And as a photographer, I thought when I started this project, the time I spent here, I would be a little bit frustrated because normally when I do photography, especially with close-ups, I'm wandering around, I'm following the light, I'm looking for opportunities, and I'm pretty mobile. And I thought I'm going to get frustrated because while I'm sitting here staring at the same space over and over, I'm going to wonder what I'm missing out on other places. And as it turned out, it was the opposite, that when I was other places doing my job or taking pictures or doing something else in other prairies, my mind always went back to my square meter plot. And I thought, what am I missing because I'm not there today? Which was a pretty cool change of perspective for me. And even today, when I'm out taking pictures, there'll be times where I'm walking around and I'm not finding anything. And I just sort of have to slap myself on the head and say, okay, stop, take a breath, sit down, just stare around nearby. And I always find something to take a picture of when I do that. I always do. And this last picture is sort of the emblematic picture that I think tells that story best, because it was in May. I was trying to figure out whether this project was really going to work or not, because nothing was blooming yet in the plot. They didn't burn the prairie like I thought they were going to. So everything was a little bit behind. It was thatchy and cool, and there wasn't anything flowering. And I thought, man, do I really want to do this for a full year? This is a lot of work. And then as I sat there, I started to notice how the light was coming through this sunflower leaf in a really pretty way. So I set up my tripod and I focused in on the leaf, and I thought, this is really pretty. And then as I did that, I noticed that up and down the stem of the sunflower, there was a bunch of ants moving back and forth. And I knew from previous experience that sunflowers are one of the species that produce extra floral nectar as a way to attract ants, right? So they're buying protection. They're attracting these predators to themselves to help protect against herbivores. And I thought, well, that would be a really fun thing if I was able to get a picture of this ant coming across this leaf that's so really well backlit. But it took 10 minutes before that ant came through the frame and I was able to get a picture of it. And just the idea that I would spend 10 minutes staring at one leaf, waiting for an ant to come through, was a different way of photographing than I'd ever done before. And by the end of the year, it didn't seem like a new or strange thing at all. But at the time, it was something that was pretty different for me. And so it was a really kind of a watershed moment, I think, for the entire project, which is why I usually end with this photo. So to wrap up, I think for me, it turned out to be a project that was really effective, and it resonated well with people in terms of showing how much can happen in a prairie, even within a small area. It's also a nice project because, again, the strip of prairie that I worked in is not particularly unique or diverse compared to other sites nearby. And really anybody who has a prairie nearby could do the same project and see many of the same things. And so I hope that those two facts combined will change people's perceptions of prairies in a helpful way. And like I said at the end, it changed me much more than I thought. I mean, Gail said, I've been doing prairie stuff for more than 25 years. It's not a new thing for me. And I've been photographing small creatures and flowers for a long time. I thought I was going to be teaching other people things, and I did, but it was also something that changed me in a way that I wasn't expecting. So I want to end with this. I've just shown you this project. One way to describe the project would be this headline, right? Hey, some pointy-headed scientist found 113 species in a single square meter of prairie, and that would get some attention from people who didn't, expect that. But it would be pretty short-lived attention, I think. I don't think it would live in people's heads very long. But the fact that I can tell the stories from there and describe it in a way that's personal to me, that shows the passion that I had for the project, gets people drawn in a very different way than a dry headline. And I think that's the point. So this project became a book called Hidden Prairie that, it's not making anybody any money. The Nature Conservancy gets the proceeds. But the fact that, staring at a square meter of ground for a year can turn into a book said something about how well the project resonated with people. And then even bigger surprise, we ended up getting a museum exhibit. We got a 6-month museum exhibit at the State of Nebraska State Museum in Lincoln, which is really fantastic because it allows people to come in and get that experience of looking closely. We built these frames, these square meter plots of prairie using actual prairie plants that we preserved, and we put mounted insects in there so people could stare at them and find them and kind of get a similar experience to what I had gone through, which is far beyond anything I would have hoped for. So I'm just going to end with this, which is I'd like to encourage all of you, hopefully, to think about how can you share your story? Who's the audience that you can share it with? What's the passion that you have that you could share? And whether you do it through social media or with a bowling team or anybody you interact with, it can be effective. It doesn't have to be anything like I'm doing. You could do it in your own way. So I'm going to end there. And thanks for the invitation. And if people have questions or things we want to talk about, we can do that too.
you, Chris. That was beautiful photographs. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I can appreciate, I taught a class in the Cascade Mountains, and we'd go every spring, same time every year. And I was completely amazed when I had a chance to go back 2 weeks later, a month later, and 10 years later, I did that. And I was like, wow, there's a whole different flora here.
Yeah.
It's quite beautiful to be able to recognize that. So
Chris, that was
Jack.
really inspirational. And I'm wondering if you have seen kind of an uptick in prairie interest over the last 2 years in terms of support or questions or.
I mean, I wish I could say that, but I guess what I have seen is I really have seen a lot of interest in the project. I've gotten a lot of contacts from people who want to copy it in some way, which is great. You know, everything from people who are telling me, hey, I started doing this in my backyard with my own little prairie garden, or schools have done it. I've heard from several different schools who have done it, and they'll have all the kids take a hula hoop out to the prairie, and they'll throw it out, and then they'll just have the kids stare at that for a while to see how much they can find. Or I think it was the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum started a project where they had volunteers that would come out and do it. Actually, 2 different sites did that. It's just, so I definitely saw that, which is really encouraging. I hope that, like that museum exhibit, that's where, you know, people that buy the book, if you buy it for somebody else, I guess it's not preaching to the choir, but a lot of people that buy the book are already going to be prairie people. But with the museum exhibit, it's going to hopefully draw in people that have sort of a nature adjacent interest, and maybe bring them into the fold in a different way, which I think would be more successful.
That's great. We can ask our audience to open up if they have any questions. You can unmute and stop your.
You can also put it in the chat or unmute. We do have a couple questions. I mean,
Yeah.
I think would be a great project for kids. My 11-year-old stepdaughter was listening, and she's talking about spiders, and I was like, yeah, he just took a space. We could do this in our garden and look at and see what happened throughout the year.
Yep.
So we do have some questions. Oh, she said flies. She's correcting me. It wasn't spiders, it was flies. Did you check it at all at night?
Man, I would have loved to. Because it was a photographic project and I'm not set up for nighttime photography, I didn't. But, you know, boy, yeah, think about that, right? How much I could have found if I would have gone at night. The other part of that is underground, right? I mean, I didn't look at all in the soil for the same reason. It's really hard to stick a camera down in the soil and take the kind of pictures I wanted to get out of this project. So if it would have been a pure inventory project, and I was just really going for numbers of species, the nighttime, the soils, I would have gone more often. I could have attracted things in, which probably would have been cheating. But so, yeah, quick answer is no, I didn't do anything at night.
Did you check for leaf miners and how about soil organisms? Those were from the same.
Yeah, so like I said, no soil organisms. Leaf miners, I don't think I had any leaf miners that I saw. I definitely had some damage to plants that in some cases I counted as a species. If I knew somebody that could tell me, okay, here's what did this to the plant, like the head cutting weevil, right? There were some burrows that I saw into stems of plants, and I could find somebody who told me what made that, then I would count that as a species. If I got a picture of the damage or of the impact. I don't think I did have any leaf miners, which is crazy actually, now that you mention that, because there should have been. I just didn't see any. But I also didn't see things like grasshopper. I mean, I saw one grasshopper species and one katydid species, which is pretty insane if you think about it. Grasshoppers are everywhere in prairies. They're named after grass, for goodness sake. But I only found one in the plot for some reason.
What was the ratio of invasives to natives, like in the insects? And
pretty
you
low.
mentioned just a couple.
Yeah, they were pretty low. You know, really the praying mantises and the Japanese beetles are the only ones that I know of that I got photos of, at least, that were invasive, or at least non-native. And, you know, to counter that, there were a couple different cuckoo bee species, which are pretty specialist. There were, 3 or 4, I think 4 different insect species that are specialists to one flower or a group of flowers. So that was really cool to see within that little remote, isolated small prairie, that there were things that were specialists that had been able to make that connection and find a new place to live.
We have a couple more questions coming in. Are yuccas native to Nebraska prairies?
Yeah, yeah. Yucca glauca is the species that we have here.
Another. I guess this is a comment. A lot of times there are parasitoids of leaf miners, so you might have to collect and rear minor leaves and see what emerges.
Yeah, yeah. Oh man, parasitoids are the best. Another really great set of stories to talk to people about, right? You just like telling them a horror movie story plot. When from this innocuous looking creature that you'd never would guess does what it does.
Yes, some of the camouflage on those. The first one you showed, what that was an Artemisia.
The grasshopper, yeah, Cudweed grasshopper. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
It seems like, I guess, is a comment that this would be a good project if you weren't familiar with, if you wanted to do something like this, you weren't familiar with the different insect species or flora, you could use iNaturalist to maybe, identify some of the species.
Yeah. Yes, the caterpillar was a Synchlora, exactly. Yep. Synchlora aerata. And you're right, Stephen. I mean, not the iNaturalist for sure. Bug Guide is a great resource that I use, bugguide.net.
Okay.
And a lot of the insect species here, I mean, I'm no entomologist, I'm an insect enthusiast. And so I take pictures of things and then I send them to people who can identify them for me mostly. And I'm getting better at it, but yeah, bugguide.net, you send them the picture, they have an expert look at it, they identify it for you, they email you back, and then they add it to their collection. And then you can also just browse through their photos. And if you find something that looks kind of like what you have, you can follow the stream until it looks more and more like yours until you get to your species, or at least something pretty close. So I recommend Bug Guide pretty highly. I'll put it in the chat.
Great. Another question, what kind of camera and lens do you use for the tiny insects?
So I'm using a pretty cheap Nikon camera. It's so the DSLR cameras, you get the full sensor and the not full sensor. The full sensor are the more expensive cameras. I don't have one of those. So I have a smaller sensor camera and I use a 105 millimeter macro lens, which allows me to have a little bit of distance from the insects when I take a picture. I'm not putting my nose right on their nose, but still close enough that, I have to be really careful. And the longer telephoto type macro lenses are nice because they limit the field of view around the insect. It allows you to take more of a portrait view of the insect. Since the project, I've invested in a fisheye lens, really, really wide angle lens. And those are also fun. You don't get the insects don't look as big, but if it's a relatively good size insect and you can get it to sit still, you can put yourself right up to the insect, and then you can show the insect in its environment in a very different way too. So those are kind of two extremes that tell the same story in different ways, which is fun. But yeah, 105 millimeter macro lens is the sweet spot for me. That's the length I really like.
Maybe I missed this, but did you choose a part in the prairie that would be less likely to be interacted with other humans, or?
Kind of. I mean, there's a mode trail that I showed that goes right through that little strip of prairie. Mm-hmm. It's in a part of the prairie that most people don't walk through. So there's a lot of hikers and bikers that come through the prairie in other places, but not so much back there. But it wasn't so much about that. It was more about finding an access point for me and a place that was going to have good light. Right. So I wanted good southern exposure so that I would have light coming through. Actually, having trees not too far from the north was helpful in terms of breaking the wind sometimes. So it was more strategic for other reasons, but I'm trying to think, I think there was maybe only one or two times I saw anybody coming by as I was out there working on the project. So I was kind of by myself, which is good because it's a little uncomfortable when you're laying on the ground, taking a picture of a spider when somebody comes up behind you and you have to try to explain what you're doing there.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the comment about the Canon and the NPE 65 millimeter. Yeah, I've looked at some different lenses that can really get you even closer than mine. I like the idea of it. I'm a little worried about, it's already hard to keep them from moving and then you get in closer, but I do notice that I'm missing some things that are smaller than my lens can really show off very well. So I'm looking at some options.
Have people who draw and sketch kind of been inspired?
I mean, I hope
Yeah.
so, because there's no reason you couldn't do the same project that way, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely. And again, I mean, as a photographer, I can show visually what I was seeing, but you could do the same thing by just writing about it or talking about it,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you don't have to have the pictures to make the project work. Just the fact that you sat and had the experience of, you know, settling down, calming down, really paying attention, describe what that feeling is like. There's a lot of ways you could do it, but yeah, definitely drawing and sketching would be fantastic.
Any other questions for Chris? It is 2 hours later. It'd be past my bedtime, but we're getting close.
I'm surviving so far. Don't worry.
yeah. If you can open your videos, we can really thank Chris, and he can see our faces.
Mhm.
It is nice to be able to see people's faces at some point.
Yeah. I know there's several photographers in the audience, and some who have worked on my team to photograph phenology over the last couple of years. So that's inspirational to us all.
Well, I'm glad I could help.
Yeah, no.
I'm jealous of the field trips you have. We're months away from anything flowering here. So the fact that you're going out on field trips to see flowers is pretty amazing to me.
Yeah, we've kind of got the sweet spot for temperate, I think.
There'll be some ferns too. There'll be.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for joining us. And
Yeah,
thank you so
let's
much,
give
Chris.
Chris a hand here.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Chris.
Yep. Oh, and if you think of other things, you know, Gail's got my email address. You're more than welcome to contact me. I'd be happy to talk to you more.
Yeah, please, you can just contact me or look up the Prairie ecologists on the internet and you'll find Chris right away.
Yep.
So,
All right.
All right, thank you. Good night,
Thanks,
everybody.
Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks
Chris.
a lot.
Very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming too. Really appreciate it.
That's a Jenny.
Thanks a lot. That was great.
Good to see everyone.
Bye, dear. Bye, Stephen.